The wind didn't just sting, it cut. Snow swirled so thick it blurred the streetlights, burying the world in a white haze that made everything feel smaller, quieter, and far more dangerous. Grace clutched her son's hand, the boy's mittened fingers trembling inside hers, his little body leaning into her side for warmth. They stood on the shoveled strip of sidewalk in front of the apartment building they'd called home for almost 4 years, staring at the locked door and the man behind it. Mr. Keller, the landlord, kept his shoulders square and his scarf wrapped tight, his voice almost lost in the wind. "You're 3 weeks late, Grace. I've been patient, but I can't carry you any longer." She tightened her grip on Ethan's hand. "It's the middle of a snowstorm. Please, just until morning. He's only 6. "I'm sorry," Keller said, though there wasn't much sorry in his tone. "I've got rules to follow, and other tenants to think about. You'll have to make other arrangements." He shut the door firmly, the latch clicking loud enough to echo under the awning. Grace stood there for a moment, staring at the wood grain of the door, half expecting it to open again. It didn't. Her breath came out in sharp bursts, clouding in the freezing air. Ethan tilted his head up, eyes wide under the brim of his wool hat. "Where will we go?" he asked, his voice small. Grace knelt, brushing snow from his shoulders. "Somewhere warm," she promised, though she had no idea how she'd keep it. The bus routes were already shutting down. Shelters would be packed, and the nearest one was miles away. The snow crunched behind her as she stood, hoisting their single duffel higher onto her shoulder. She started walking, more to keep them moving than because she had a plan. The cold bit through her coat, seeped into her boots. Ethan's boots were too small. They'd been hand-me-downs from a neighbor's kid, and she could feel the cold radiating from his toes into her leg whenever he pressed against her. The street was nearly empty. Most windows were lit with the warm gold of families huddled inside, safe and dry. Grace kept her eyes forward, trying not to imagine what they must look like. A woman and her son wandering aimlessly in a blizzard with no destination, no safety net, no one coming. Then, up ahead, through the veil of snow, she saw it, a row of elegant brownstones, each with a set of steps rising from the sidewalk, each door painted in rich, glossy colors. At the far end, one stood out. The deep green door glowed under a brass light fixture, and warm light spilled from the tall front windows, painting the snow in gold. Grace didn't know why she slowed, or why her eyes kept flicking to it as they passed. She'd seen the man who lived there once or twice, a tall figure in a dark coat, stepping into a chauffeured car, his stride easy but purposeful. She'd overheard a neighbor mention he was loaded, but had never learned his name. Ethan tugged her hand. "It looks warm in there," he said. "It does," she agreed softly, guiding him forward. They'd only gone a few steps when another gust of wind ripped through them, sending icy flakes into her eyes. Ethan stumbled, and she stopped to steady him. That's when she heard the creak. She turned. The green door was opening. The man stood there, framed in the doorway, the light behind him outlining his broad shoulders and neat sweater. His eyes scanned the street until they found her. "You're freezing," he said, his voice deep and certain even over the howl of the wind. "Come inside." Grace shook her head. "We're fine." "You're not fine," he interrupted, stepping on to the top stair. "It's below 0 out here. I can see the boy shivering from here." She hesitated, every instinct warning her about stepping into a stranger's home, but Ethan's hand squeezed hers hard. She looked down at him. Red cheeks, watery eyes, lips pressed together to keep from chattering, and knew she didn't have the luxury of pride. "Just for a few minutes," she said. "Until the storm eases." He nodded once, as if the negotiation were already settled. "I'm Daniel," he said, holding the door wider. "Come in, both of you." She climbed the steps slowly. Ethan pressed against her side, the snow swirling harder around them. And when she crossed the threshold, the blast of warmth was so intense she almost stumbled. The door shut behind them, sealing out the storm. The heat in Daniel's house didn't just thaw her skin. It sank straight to the bone, loosening the tight grip the cold had on her muscles. Grace stood just inside the entryway, drops of melting snow sliding off her coat and pooling onto the polished hardwood. Ethan clung to her side, wide-eyed as he took in the soaring ceilings, the grand staircase, and the faint scent of cedar and something richer, like freshly brewed coffee and a wood fire. Daniel shut the door firmly against the howl of the wind, hanging his coat on a brass hook. "Boots off," he said gently, glancing at their soaked shoes. "I'll grab towels." Grace hesitated, not used to being told what to do in someone else's home, but she bent to unlace Ethan's boots first. The snow-packed leather peeled away to reveal damp socks, and her heart twisted at how cold they felt. She slipped them off quickly, rubbing his small feet between her palms to coax warmth back into them. Daniel returned with 2 thick towels, kneeling beside her without ceremony to wrap one around Ethan's feet, and the other around her shoulders. The gesture startled her. It had been a long time since anyone tended to her needs without expecting something in return. "The fire's on in the sitting room," he said. "You'll both warm up faster there." She followed him through a wide archway into a room that looked like it had been lifted from a magazine. Dark, green walls, deep leather chairs, a couch big enough for 3 people to lie on, and a stone fireplace where flames licked steadily at the logs. He gestured toward the couch. "Sit." She settled with Ethan beside her, the fire's heat making her cheeks prickle as the chill lifted. Daniel disappeared for a moment and returned with a tray, 2 steaming mugs and a plate of biscuits dusted with sugar. "Hot cocoa?" he said, handing one mug to Ethan and one to her. "Extra marshmallows? I hope that's okay." Ethan's eyes lit up as he took the first sip, and Grace managed a small smile. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," Daniel said simply, lowering himself into the chair across from them. "You were out there in a blizzard. Why?" Grace's fingers tightened on the mug. "Our landlord decided 3 weeks late on rent was too much to tolerate. I asked for 1 night until the storm passed. He locked us out instead." Daniel's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "You don't have family nearby?" "No," she said softly. "It's just us." "Friends?" She shook her head. "Not the kind you can show up to with no notice in the middle of a snowstorm." He studied her for a moment, not in a way that made her feel exposed, but in a way that made her think he was cataloging her situation, turning over solutions in his mind. "You can stay here tonight," he said. Grace blinked. "We couldn't." "You could, and you should," he interrupted. "The roads are closing, shelters are at capacity, and the forecast says this storm won't let up until tomorrow afternoon at the earliest. I have space, and heat, and food. Let me help." She hesitated. The last time she'd relied on someone, it had cost her dearly. But she looked at Ethan, sipping cocoa with pink cheeks and relaxed shoulders, and knew she couldn't drag him back into the storm out of fear. "Just 1 night," she said firmly. "We'll be gone as soon as it's clear." 1 night, Daniel agreed, though there was something in his tone that told her he wasn't going to let them walk into trouble again so easily. He stood. "Come on, I'll show you the guest room. It's warm and it has its own bathroom." Ethan perked up. "Like a hotel?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Better." He led them upstairs to a room with a large bed layered in thick quilts, a dresser, and a window that framed the swirling snow outside. Grace set their small duffel on the floor, suddenly aware of how little they had brought. Daniel lingered at the door. "Extra blankets are in the closet. If you need anything, my room's just down the hall." And, "Grace?" She looked up. "You're safe here." The words hit harder than the heat, and for the first time in weeks, she let herself believe they might be true. Grace woke to the muted glow of daylight filtering through the thick curtains, the world outside still muffled by snow. For a moment, she forgot where she was, the unfamiliar weight of the quilt and the distant crackle of a fireplace in the hall disorienting her. Then she heard Ethan's soft snore from the other side of the bed, and remembered. Daniel's house, the blizzard, the green door opening just as the cold had nearly beaten her down. She slid carefully from beneath the covers, her feet sinking into a plush rug, and crossed to the window. The city street below was buried in white, the sidewalks invisible under drifts, and cars encased in icy shells. No one was out, not even the usual dog walkers. She could almost believe the world had stopped. The scent of coffee drifted up the stairs, rich and warm, making her stomach twist with hunger. It had been 2 days since she'd eaten a proper breakfast. She glanced at Ethan, still curled into the mound of blankets, his hair tousled and his mouth slightly open. She didn't want to wake him yet, so she pulled on yesterday's clothes, smoothing the wrinkles as best she could, and padded into the hall. Daniel was in the kitchen, standing at a gas range, flipping something in a skillet. The space was vast, the kind of kitchen she'd only seen in magazines: marble counters, a farmhouse sink, copper pots hanging from a rack above the island. He turned when he heard her, offering a small smile. "Good morning. I hope you like pancakes." Grace's instinct was to refuse, to insist she'd be fine with just coffee, but the smell of butter and syrup melted that resolve. "You really don't have to—" "I know," he said, cutting her off with the same quiet certainty as the night before. "But I want to." She sat at the island, watching him move easily through the kitchen. He poured coffee into a mug and slid it toward her. "You slept?" "Better than I have in weeks," she admitted. "Ethan?" "Still out. I figured I'd let him rest." Daniel nodded. "Good. He needs it. Kids don't handle cold like adults do." The mention of the cold made her remember the landlord's face, the way he'd shut the door without a flicker of doubt. Her hands tightened around the mug. Daniel noticed. "What's your plan?" She stared at the swirling coffee. "Once the buses start running again, I'll try the shelter downtown. I can't pay rent anywhere right now, so—" She trailed off, embarrassed. "What kind of work do you do?" "I used to be a receptionist," she said, "but they downsized last year. Since then it's been part-time retail and cleaning jobs, whatever I could find around Ethan's school schedule." Daniel set a plate of pancakes in front of her, golden and steaming, and leaned on the counter. "You know, there's no law that says you have to figure this out alone." Grace gave a small, humorless laugh. "There's also no line of people waiting to help." "Maybe not a line," he said, "but sometimes one person's enough." She didn't know how to answer that, so she focused on eating, the warmth spreading from her stomach to her fingertips. Ethan appeared a few minutes later, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, and Daniel immediately made a smaller plate for him, adding extra syrup without asking. Watching her son eat without rushing, without shivering, without looking over his shoulder, it did something to her chest she couldn't name. After breakfast, Daniel excused himself to take a call in his office. Grace began clearing dishes, unsure if she should leave the room spotless to prove she wasn't taking advantage. She'd just finished rinsing the last plate when she heard voices in the hall, one of them far less friendly than Daniel's. "She owes 3 weeks' rent, Daniel," Keller's voice said. "You can't just shelter her indefinitely. It's bad precedent." Grace froze. Daniel's reply was calm but firm. "What I do in my own home isn't your business." "It is when she's one of my tenants." "Correction," Daniel said evenly. "She was your tenant. Now she's my guest." Keller scoffed. "Don't get sentimental. She'll drain you dry." "I think I can handle my own resources," Daniel replied. There was a pause, then the sound of footsteps retreating. Grace stayed rooted to the spot, her heart pounding. When Daniel came back into the kitchen, he didn't mention the exchange. He just handed her a scarf from a hook near the door. "If you want some air, the back garden's shoveled." She took it, not sure if he'd deliberately ignored what she'd overheard, or if he was waiting for her to bring it up. Either way, the certainty in his voice when he'd called her his guest lingered in her mind long after she stepped into the walled garden, the snow sparkling in the pale sun. The garden behind Daniel's brownstone was like something out of another life, an enclosed square bordered by brick walls, the snow neatly cleared from a winding stone path. A wrought iron bench sat under a leafless maple, its branches dusted with white. Grace walked slowly, the scarf Daniel had given her snug around her neck, her breath still clouding in the air. She didn't often get to stand somewhere that felt this quiet, this insulated from the chaos outside. The storm had stopped, leaving only a sky so clear it seemed sharper than reality. Ethan was by the bench, poking at the snow with a stick he'd found, his laughter carrying easily in the stillness. For the first time in weeks, he sounded like a child again. Grace let herself watch him for a moment before Daniel stepped out, the back door closing softly behind him. He wore a dark coat over his sweater, his hands in his pockets. "It's a good day for sunlight," he said, glancing around the garden. "After a storm like that, it feels earned." She smiled faintly. "It's beautiful. I didn't expect a garden back here." "It's my sanctuary," he admitted. "Good for thinking. Or for not thinking." They walked together, toward the bench, the snow crunching underfoot. He nodded toward Ethan. "He's resilient." "He has to be," she said, the warmth in her tone underscored by something heavier. "I've tried to keep things from feeling too unstable for him, but kids know more than you think." Daniel studied her profile. "Which is why I'm going to say this now before you brush it off. You don't have to go to that shelter." She looked at him quickly. "Daniel." "Hear me out," he said, lifting a hand. "You can stay here. Not forever, not without contributing, but long enough to get back on your feet. I have more rooms than I use, and the company wouldn't be unwelcome." Her instinct was to reject it, to keep a safe distance from relying on someone who could just as easily change his mind. But the words caught in her throat. "You don't know me," she said softly. "You don't know what you'd be signing up for." "Maybe not," he admitted. "But I know what I saw 2 nights ago. A mother willing to walk into a blizzard for her child rather than compromise her dignity. That tells me enough." The wind picked up slightly, sending a swirl of snow over the path. Ethan ran toward them, cheeks flushed, holding up his stick like it was a sword. "Look, I made a path to the corner." Grace smiled at him. "That's great, honey." Daniel crouched to Ethan's height. "What do you think? Would you and your mom like to stay here for a little while, until it's warmer?" Ethan's eyes darted to Grace, a silent question shining in them. She hesitated, the weight of his hope pressing against her caution. "I don't want to be a burden," she murmured. Daniel straightened, meeting her gaze without flinching. "You won't be. I'm offering this because I want to, and because I know what it's like to be left without a safety net." That last sentence made her pause. "You?" He gave a small, humorless smile. A long time ago. Different circumstances, same feeling. They returned to the house, the warmth of the interior wrapping around them again. In the kitchen, Daniel poured coffee for himself and tea for her, the domesticity of it feeling strange but not unpleasant. "I can help around the house," she said finally. "Cook, clean, whatever you need. I can pay something once I find work." "We'll talk about that later," he said, his tone gentle but final. "For now, just know you and Ethan aren't going back out into the cold." The truth of it settled into her slowly, loosening something in her chest she hadn't realized was clenched. For the first time since the eviction, she allowed herself to imagine more than just surviving the day. She glanced at Daniel over the rim of her cup, and he caught her looking. Neither of them said anything, but there was a shared understanding in the silence, that this was the start of something neither had planned, but both might need. 2 days later, the snow was still piled high along the streets, but life had begun creeping back into motion. Grace found herself falling into a quiet rhythm in Daniel's home, helping with breakfast, reading to Ethan by the fire, and taking small walks in the garden when the air was bearable. Daniel kept his work mostly to himself, disappearing into his home office for hours, but emerging for meals and the occasional conversation that seemed to warm the edges of the house. It was almost easy to pretend they belonged there, until the knock came. It was sharp, deliberate, the kind of knock that made you straighten before you even reached the door. Grace had been in the living room folding laundry when she heard it. Before she could move, Daniel appeared from the hall and opened the door to reveal a woman in a tailored wool coat, her lipstick flawless despite the cold. She looked at Daniel with a familiarity that didn't need explaining. "You've been hard to reach," she said. Her eyes flicked past him and landed on Grace, narrowing slightly as if slotting her into a category in seconds. Daniel's tone was even. "Rebecca, now isn't a good time." "Apparently not," she said, stepping forward just enough to make her presence impossible to ignore. "I came because I heard from Keller that you've taken in guests." The pause before the last word carried more judgment than she bothered to hide. Grace felt her cheeks heat, though not from shame, more from the way this stranger spoke like she was an intrusion in her own survival. "Rebecca," Daniel said, voice low but firm. "This is Grace and her son, Ethan. They're staying here temporarily." Rebecca's smile was tight. "Temporarily. Of course. I just hope you know what you're doing. People talk, Daniel, and not all of them will assume you're being charitable." "I'm not concerned with what people assume," he said. Rebecca's gaze lingered on Grace for another beat before she turned back to him. "Dinner Friday? Or is your house too full?" "I'll call you," he said, his expression unreadable. She left without another word, her boots crunching against the icy steps until the sound faded. Daniel closed the door slowly, resting his hand on it for a moment before turning toward Grace. "She's an old acquaintance," he said, as though that explained enough. Grace folded the towel in her hands with deliberate care. "She seemed very interested in your living arrangements." "She's interested in things that aren't her business," he replied, moving toward the kitchen. "Don't let her get under your skin." But Grace couldn't quite shake the feeling that Rebecca's words had been meant to plant seeds, doubts about why Daniel had opened his door to her, what others might think, and how easily kindness could be twisted into something else. Later that afternoon, Ethan tugged her towards the front window to watch a snowplow crawl down the street. His laughter was bright, but Grace's mind kept circling back to Rebecca's sharp smile. She had seen women like that before, people who lived in a world where shelter and safety were a given, and where helping someone like Grace was a curiosity at best. a liability at worst. That night, as she tucked Ethan into bed, she asked softly, "Do you like it here?" He nodded, his eyes heavy with sleep. "It's warm, and Daniel's nice. He doesn't get mad when I spill things." She kissed his forehead, her heart aching with the simplicity of his answer. Downstairs, Daniel was in the study, his desk lit by a single lamp. She hovered in the doorway until he looked up. "About Rebecca," she began, but he shook his head. "Grace, you don't owe anyone an explanation for being here, least of all her." "I just don't want to cause trouble for you," she said. "You won't," he replied. "Trouble tends to show up whether we invite it or not, but it doesn't change what's right." His voice was steady, and something about it cut through the unease that had been building all afternoon. Still, as she went upstairs later, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that Rebecca's visit had been more than a social call. It had been a warning. The following morning brought an unexpected quiet, the kind that made the air feel heavy with unspoken things. Grace was in the kitchen washing the breakfast dishes when Daniel appeared, holding a cream-colored envelope in one hand. He set it on the counter beside her. "For you," he said. She dried her hands, staring at the envelope like it might bite. "From who?" "Rebecca," he replied, watching her reaction carefully. "She dropped it by early this morning." Grace hesitated before sliding her finger under the flap, unfolding the thick cardstock. The handwriting was precise, almost too elegant, and the words were short. "Friday, 7 p.m. dinner at the Whitmore Club. Both of you." Grace's brow furrowed. "Both?" "Apparently she wants to meet you. Properly," Daniel said, his tone betraying nothing. "You don't have to go. I can tell her no." Grace's first instinct was to refuse outright. The thought of sitting across from Rebecca in some gilded dining room, every eye on her, every fork and glass a silent reminder that she didn't belong, it was enough to make her chest tighten. But then she looked at Ethan, who was at the table coloring in a picture of the garden, completely at ease in a place that wasn't his home. She had promised herself she wouldn't let her fear of judgment dictate their future anymore. "I'll go," she said quietly. Daniel studied her for a moment. "Are you sure?" "She's not subtle." Grace managed a faint smile. "Neither am I when I need to be." Over the next 2 days, she found herself thinking about the dinner more than she wanted to. She had nothing suitable to wear, nothing that would allow her to step into a club like that, without feeling like she'd stepped into a play she didn't have a script for. On Thursday afternoon, Daniel surprised her again. He returned from an errand with a large garment bag and set it on the couch. "Before you argue," he said quickly, "this isn't charity. Consider it an investment in making sure you're comfortable." Grace unzipped the bag to find a simple but stunning dark blue dress, the fabric soft and flowing. "Daniel, I can't accept—" "You can," he interrupted gently. "And you will, if only to make Rebecca's face when you walk in worth every penny." His grin was quick, almost boyish, and for a moment it disarmed her completely. Friday evening arrived with a crisp wind that rattled the bare branches outside. Grace stood in front of the mirror, the dress fitting as though it had been made for her hair swept back simply. Ethan was with Mrs. Patel, the neighbor from 2 doors down who had eagerly offered to watch him for the night. Daniel, in a tailored suit, looked at her when she came downstairs, in a way that made her feel both steady and unsettled. "Ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be," she replied. The Whitmore Club was everything she'd imagined: marble floors, chandeliers, and a hum of quiet conversations that seemed to bend around wealth like an invisible barrier. Rebecca was waiting at a table near the center, her smile sharp but polished. "You made it," she said, standing to air-kiss Daniel before extending a hand to Grace. "And you must be the famous neighbor." Grace shook her hand, feeling the faintest pressure of challenge in Rebecca's grip. The dinner began politely enough, though Grace noticed every sideways glance from other tables, every subtle flicker in Rebecca's expression, when Grace answered a question with confidence instead of apology. Halfway through the meal, Rebecca leaned forward slightly. "It must be quite an adjustment, going from where you were to here." Grace set her fork down carefully. "It's amazing what you can adjust to when the alternative is freezing in the snow with your child." Daniel's gaze flicked to her, something like pride in his eyes. Rebecca's smile didn't falter, but her eyes cooled. "Well," she said, lifting her wine glass, "to adjustments." Grace met her gaze and lifted her own water glass. "To survival." The clink between them was soft, but it felt like a declaration. When they left the club, the cold air hit Grace's cheeks, sharper than before. Daniel held the car door open for her, his voice low. "You handled that better than I could have hoped." Grace exhaled slowly, her pulse still thrumming. "She's not going to stop testing me, is she?" "Probably not," he admitted. "But now she knows you're not going to break." The following week passed under a strange tension, the memory of that dinner lingering like the aftertaste of something bitter. Grace tried to push it aside, focusing on finding steady work. But every time she passed the coat rack where Daniel's suit hung, or saw the dress bag folded neatly in her closet, Rebecca's voice echoed in her head. On Wednesday afternoon, Grace returned from the library, where she'd been filling out job applications, to find Daniel in the front hall speaking to Keller, the landlord who had evicted her. He was holding a clipboard and looked irritated at having been kept waiting. "I told you before," Daniel was saying, his tone controlled but clipped. "This is no longer your concern." Keller smirked, leaning casually against the doorframe. "She owes me back rent, and I have the right to collect." Grace froze just inside the doorway. Daniel's voice sharpened. "You forfeited that right the second you put her and her child out in a snowstorm. If you want to discuss it further, contact my lawyer." Keller's eyes slid to her, a slow, deliberate movement. "You've landed well, haven't you?" The insinuation in his tone made Grace's stomach twist, but she met his gaze squarely. "Better than I was with you as a landlord." His smirk faltered. Without another word, Daniel stepped forward and closed the door between them with a quiet finality that carried more weight than slamming it could have. Grace stood in the foyer, her pulse still pounding. "You didn't have to—" "Yes, I did," he interrupted. "That man has no claim on you anymore, and I won't let him try to intimidate you." She swallowed, nodding, unsure how to respond to the fierce protectiveness in his tone. The rest of the day was subdued. Ethan had a playdate at Mrs. Patel's, leaving Grace and Daniel alone in the house. They ended up in the kitchen together, preparing dinner almost without speaking, until Daniel finally said, "You've been quieter since Friday." Grace hesitated. "Rebecca's not just some friend, is she?" His jaw tightened. "She's from my parents' world. They think connections like hers are important." "And what do you think?" "I think I stopped living by their rules a long time ago," he said, looking directly at her. "Which is why I'm not interested in her approval, or Keller's, or anyone else's." Grace held his gaze, feeling the air shift between them. Before she could say more, the sound of the front door opening broke the moment. Mrs. Patel had brought Ethan home early. He bounded into the kitchen, chattering about a snow fort he and his friends had built, and the heaviness lifted for the evening. But that night, after Ethan was asleep, Grace found herself standing at the upstairs window, looking out over the snow-covered street. She thought about the way Keller had looked at her, the way Rebecca had tested her, and the way Daniel had stepped in front of both of them without hesitation. It was a gesture she wasn't used to, having someone draw a line so firmly on her behalf. She wondered how long it would last, and what it might mean if she let herself trust it. It was a Saturday morning when the call came, slicing through the quiet like a sharp edge. Grace had been in the kitchen making toast for Ethan when Daniel walked in with his phone pressed to his ear, his expression unreadable. He gestured for her to wait as he listened, nodding a few times, then finally said, "I'll think about it," before hanging up. She tilted her head. "Everything okay?" He set the phone down on the counter. "That was my friend Marcus. He runs a small design and marketing firm downtown. He needs someone to manage the front desk and coordinate client schedules. It's not glamorous, but it's steady. He asked if I knew anyone looking for work." Grace blinked, her first thought a rush of disbelief. "You mean me?" "Yes, you," Daniel said, his tone both warm and matter-of-fact. "I told him you'd be perfect. Good with people, organized, and not afraid to handle pressure." She looked down at her hands, the weight of the offer settling in. "I don't have recent office experience, just reception work from before Ethan was born." "That's more than enough," he said. "Marcus isn't looking for perfection, he's looking for reliability, and I told him you have that in spades." Grace hesitated, the familiar knot of self-doubt tightening in her chest. The thought of walking into a real office again, dressed properly, answering phones, meeting clients, felt like stepping into a different version of herself, one she wasn't sure she still knew how to be. "It's been a long time," she murmured. Daniel leaned against the counter, studying her. "Then maybe it's time to prove to yourself you can do it again." Ethan wandered in, hair sticking up in every direction, and climbed onto a stool. "What's happening?" Grace smiled faintly. "Your mom might have a new job." His eyes lit up. "Really? Can I tell Mrs. Patel?" "If it works out," she said. "We'll see." But even as she spoke, part of her wanted to believe it was already decided. Later that afternoon, Daniel offered to drive her downtown to see the building. They pulled up in front of a modest but modern office block, sunlight glinting off the glass doors. Grace stepped out, taking in the street lined with coffee shops and small boutiques. It felt like a different world from the cramped apartment she'd lost. Inside, Marcus was waiting, a tall man with kind eyes and a quick smile. He shook her hand firmly. "Daniel's told me a lot about you," he said. "If you're half as capable as he says, I'll be lucky to have you here." They sat in a small conference room while Marcus explained the role, answering calls, greeting clients, scheduling meetings, keeping the front organized. It was nothing she hadn't done before, but hearing it laid out like this made it feel bigger somehow, like a doorway opening. "I can train you on the software," Marcus said. "The rest is about people skills, and you've got those already." Grace felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. "I'd like to try," she said. "Good," Marcus replied. "Can you start Monday?" On the drive home, she stared out the window, processing the shift that was about to happen. "I didn't expect it to happen this fast," she said. "Life rarely waits for us to be ready," Daniel replied. "Sometimes that's the point." That evening, after Ethan was asleep, Grace lingered in the living room, the fire casting a warm glow over the space. Daniel came in with 2 mugs of tea and handed her one. "You know," he said, settling into the chair across from her, "you don't have to keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. Good things aren't always a setup for disappointment." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "That's easy for you to say." "Not as easy as you think," he said quietly. The silence between them was comfortable, threaded with something unspoken. For the first time in months, she felt the faint stirrings of a future that wasn't defined by loss, but by possibility. Monday morning dawned clear, but biting cold, the kind of air that made every breath feel like it belonged to winter alone. Grace stood in front of the mirror in the upstairs guest room, smoothing the navy blouse Daniel had insisted was perfect for her first day. She had paired it with black slacks and simple flats. Nothing extravagant, but professional enough to make her stand taller. Ethan was already at Mrs. Patel's, and Daniel had offered to drive her into the city. "Ready?" he asked from the doorway, his voice steady but carrying a flicker of pride she couldn't ignore. She nodded, grabbing her coat. The drive was quiet, both of them wrapped in the anticipation of a day that felt like a turning point. Marcus greeted her at the office with a brisk warmth, showing her to the front desk and walking her through the computer system. By mid-morning, Grace had already answered half a dozen calls, greeted 3 clients, and organized the week's meeting schedule. The work was busy but not overwhelming, the kind that left little room for doubt to creep in. She was beginning to think she might actually belong there, until she saw him. Keller, standing just inside the glass doors as though he owned the place. His eyes locked on hers, a slow, unsettling smile spreading across his face. "Well, if it isn't the snowstorm princess," he said as he stepped closer to the desk. Grace's stomach tightened. "You have no business here." "On the contrary," Keller replied, leaning casually on the counter. "I'm here to meet with one of your partners. Small world, isn't it?" She didn't answer, instead picking up the phone to call Marcus. Keller's smile didn't waver. "I heard you moved in with the millionaire. Quite the upgrade from that drafty apartment." His words were low enough to keep the other staff from hearing, but sharp enough to cut. Marcus appeared moments later, his expression cool. "Keller, you're here for the 10 a.m.? This way." Keller straightened, glancing at Grace one last time. "We'll talk again," he said softly before following Marcus down the hall. Her hands were trembling slightly as she set the phone back down. She made it through the rest of the day, but Keller's presence clung to her thoughts like a shadow. By the time Daniel came to pick her up, she was wound tight. In the car, he noticed immediately. "What happened?" She hesitated, then told him. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. "He's crossing a line." "He's always crossed lines," she said quietly. "The difference is, now he knows where I am." When they pulled into the driveway, Daniel cut the engine but didn't get out right away. "Grace, I meant what I said before. You're safe here. But if he keeps showing up, I'll make sure he understands there are consequences." She met his gaze, feeling the steel in his voice. "And what if that just makes him angrier?" "Then he'll learn that anger has no power here," Daniel replied. Later that evening, after Ethan was asleep, Grace found herself in the kitchen again, washing a few stray mugs. Daniel came in, leaning against the counter. "You didn't let him get to you today," he said. "You finished the job, stayed professional. That's more than some people could do." She gave a small shrug. "I've had practice at surviving." He stepped closer, his voice low. "You deserve more than surviving." She looked up at him, the words catching in her throat. In that moment, she realized that no matter what Keller tried to stir up, she had begun to build something here. Something worth protecting. And maybe, for the first time in a long while, she wasn't the only one willing to fight for it. The snow had started falling again by evening, soft flakes drifting past the windows and settling over the world like a quiet promise. Grace was in the living room, reading to Ethan, when the knock came. 3 sharp raps that made her pause mid-sentence. Daniel looked up from his spot near the fireplace, his expression sharpening instantly. He set his book aside and went to the door, motioning for her to stay put. But the moment he opened it, Grace knew who it was. Keller stood there, snow clinging to his coat, eyes glittering with something between smugness and defiance. "We need to talk," he said. Daniel's voice was calm, but iron-wrapped. "You're trespassing. Leave now." "Not until she hears me out," Keller shot back, his gaze sliding over to Grace. She rose slowly, unwilling to let him speak about her, as though she weren't in the room. "I have nothing to say to you," she said evenly. "You've said enough with your actions." Keller's mouth twisted. "You think moving in here changes who you are? You'll always be—" He didn't get to finish. Daniel stepped forward, closing the space between them with deliberate precision. "One more word, Keller, and I'll have you escorted off this property permanently. And trust me, the police here don't take kindly to men harassing women in their own homes." Keller laughed, a brittle sound. "Fine. Enjoy your charity case, Daniel, but when she turns on you, don't say I didn't warn you." With that, he turned and trudged back to his car, his boots crunching through the snow until the sound faded into the night. Daniel shut the door with a controlled finality, locking it before turning to face Grace. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the firelight flickering across the room. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "You shouldn't have to deal with any of this." "It's not your fault," she replied. "You didn't put me out in the snow." "No," he said, his voice firm, "but I can make sure no one ever does again." Something in his tone made her chest tighten, not from fear, but from the startling realization that she believed him. That night, after Ethan was asleep, Grace sat by the fire with a mug of tea Daniel had brought her. They didn't speak for a while, the quiet settling around them like a shared blanket. Finally, she said, "You've done more for me than anyone ever has. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't owe me thanks," he said. "You just owe yourself the chance to live without looking over your shoulder." She met his gaze, feeling the weight of the moment. "Maybe for the first time, I think I can." Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the street, the gardens, and every trace of Keller's footprints. It felt symbolic, as though the world itself had decided to bury the past under something new and clean. Grace leaned back, letting the warmth of the fire seep into her bones. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Work, parenting, the whispers of people like Rebecca. But for tonight, she allowed herself the rare luxury of peace. She glanced over at Daniel, who was staring into the fire with a faint, thoughtful smile. And she realized that somewhere between the night she'd been kicked out into the snow and this moment, she had crossed an invisible threshold. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was home. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on General Common Tales. If you'd been the one to answer the door that night, would you have stood between her and the man who tried to break her? Tell us in the comments.